Hello, and welcome to the Awaken Beauty podcast. I am Cassandra, your organic beauty, positive mind management, and endocannabinoid mentor. And I am beyond elated to have Dr. Don Wood on the Awaken Beauty podcast today. He is the creator of the Inspired Performance Program, TIP. And he's going to be joining us today to have a delightful conversation about how to master our mind, which I am so passionate about. So as a clinical hypnotherapist, entrepreneur, and from absolute life experience, I understand the impact of trauma, both little and small, and how it truly can help us get further into the potential of reaching all of our life goals and out of our limitations. And so to frame it up, I want you to consider this. We have up to 80,000 thoughts a day, and 80% of them are negative, and 95% of them stem from our subconscious and are these same thoughts we probably had yesterday. So this means that you're living in about 5 to 10% of your consciousness in your life, meaning your true potential. So that's really what we're going to get into today. And so I really want you to listen to this whole epic episode with Dr. Don Wood. So let me go ahead and introduce you to Dr. Don. He has developed the Inspired Performance Institute after spending years researching how trauma affects our minds and our lives. Dr. Wood began to understand that events and experiences throughout our lifetime continue to play a role in how we experience life in the present. He also realized that there was a better way of treating these very issues. And Dr. Wood's background experience provides a unique perspective on problem solving. He uses these skills to develop the Inspired Performance Institute and NeuroXP program, as well as authoring 2 books about his research. You'll have to excuse me, I have a fly in my face. So I'm going to go ahead with that note. Dr. Don, are you with us?
I am with you, Cassandra. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, absolutely. As it is 38 degrees, we were saying before we jumped on here in Minnesota, and you just got finished with a lovely game of golf. So yeah. Welcome aboard. So I really respect all the work that you've done. As I noted, as an entrepreneur, you help other people level up in their careers, as well as a lot of women and working through their past trauma in life, in which, our Awaken Beauty podcasts are those women who really excel, are looking for, the best life possible. And your program is quite unique. And so I really want to jump into that. But maybe let's start with, how did you become awakened to this whole piece around mastering the mind, finding out how we can up-level from trauma? Tell us a little bit about your history.
Okay, thanks, Cassandra. Well, basically, it really started because I grew up in a very, very peaceful, loving, tranquil home. I had the most amazing family life. And so I just assumed everybody lived like that. I was very, very fortunate to have that. My parents never argued, never yelled. We can't even really remember them raising their voice. And so when I met my wife was living in the complete opposite household, very traumatic, very disturbing. And so I thought, okay, now that we're getting married, she's going to be living with me. She's going to be living in my world, and everything should calm down. But it didn't. She was constantly living in fear, always thinking about what could go wrong. And that was really caused by the way her mind was developed as a child. She was always looking for the danger because she had to. It wasn't a safe world for her. And then we have 3 children. Our middle child is a daughter. And when she was 14, she was diagnosed with Crohn's. And when she was 16, she told us about some trauma she had when she was 6 that we were unaware of, that had gone on for almost 2 years.
Oh, wow.
So when they told us that she had Crohn's, they said, you've got to change your diet. It's probably a dairy, it's gluten, it's whatever. She had 4 operations where they had to do resections. So she was very, very sick with that. So my wife started saying, you've got to find an answer for this. And what I really discovered was that this was really coming from the trauma. And that the trauma was affecting, because so many people who have trauma, in particular women, right, are dealing with all kinds of autoimmune issues. My wife, even she had Hashimoto's. So her thyroid burnt out because she was constantly producing cortisol. So after seeing that and sort of looking at it, I'm saying, why are they treating this with basically just medication or therapy? And I just said, there's got to be a better way to do this, because we're teaching people to live and manage and cope with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, there's got to be a better way. We can fix it. And so that was really sort of how we started. And the whole premise behind our program is there's nothing wrong with anybody's mind. Everybody's mind works perfectly fine. What's interfering with our ability to stay present and in the moment? And what I've discovered in most cases, it's unresolved trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that your example of your daughter is, whatever that past big or small T, to put it short, is everybody's experienced trauma in their life. And it can be as severe as sexual abuse. Many, many women have gone through that in their life, to something simple. I'll share just a funny story is, that darn fly. When I was in high school, I hated. Okay, I'm going to get this guy. Oh, I got it.
You got him. Wow. Look
4
at that.
days I've been chasing after that thing, and I clapped it in my hands. That was
there you go.
Manifest.
That's awesome. There you go.
That's amazing.
Perfect.
Wax on, wax off. Power of the mind.
Exactly.
But, to just frame it up, because I think everybody has their own story of a big T or a small T. And I was thinking today, before getting on this program, and as a woman, as an entrepreneur, I have some bigger T, but just to give an example of a small T, as an entrepreneur, when I was in high school, I had a great fear of math. And, the way our school systems are set up, if you fall behind, it's really hard to catch up. It's a very military and type of, yep. It's the industrial age education was sit down, be quiet. We tell you what to do. And if you don't, you're not smart. Right.
Right.
So, in math, I remember bringing my math teacher a 6-pack of giant Snickers bars, and I would set it on his desk. And he graciously, was an older teacher, was about to retire, would allow me and my friend to go out and sit in the hall and do our homework. Miraculously, right. I finished and I had a B- in math. Did okay. Right. But underneath that, I had a severe fear of numbers. And to then end up being an entrepreneur, I don't know if you've ever heard of Kathy Kolbe's profiling, but you have 4 different batteries. And I'm very, very high on the quick start and very low on follow through.
Okay.
So I'm full of ideas all the time, but follow through of like figuring out the mathematical approach to get there, I don't want to deal with it. So when I went to then become a salon owner, create my own product line, I became a really good producer. But underneath that was a great, great fear of survival. Now you can attach money to survival, and that's really what it was. And I didn't really have the maturity in the brain to really understand the way math works, the way it then attributes to business, and being very risk adverse in that very smart way versus just being a producer. And, I can go to my grave and say she was a really, really good producer, but that's certainly not what I want on my tombstone.
Right.
And so as an entrepreneur, and I know many women, even this with the fear around money, we'll go tap into our bank account. We'll make sure that we're okay. We're safe. We've got money in it, and we slap it shut as soon as we can, not really fully analytically thinking about, okay, where are we at? How can we grow this in a smart, strategic way? But it keeps me in my fear and just producing versus being smart about my business and creating a beautiful business that's strategic and has a growth mindset. Now I've moved past that, but that's just an example of a small T that underlines that fear of how we kind of generate the decisions in our life. So maybe we can talk a little bit about your incredible kind of analysis or analogy, I would say, about how the mind is a computer, and how we are running on this old app and we really need to upgrade and start working from the new system. So can you share a little bit about, how these things get stuck, with the experience, then getting stuck in the amygdala, giving us a cortisol jump, and then getting stored in the in the body and how that happens for people to really understand how their mind works and they're not a victim to their mind or experience.
Great. Yeah. So basically what I discovered is that the way that the human mind is actually very unique. We have two unique features that no other animal has. 95% of our mind is working on a subconscious basis, which is the same as an animal mind. But the animal mind is 100% subconscious. So everything for an animal is happening now. And humans, we have the same system. 95% of our mind is working in the present all the time. But we have two unique features. We have conscious awareness, is frontal lobe, that's our ability to use reason and logic. So we can figure stuff out. If we couldn't do something before, we can figure out how to do it now. Now that's very unique, and it's created the world we live in. The second feature we have is memory, and that's the ability to store billions and billions of bits of information. So everything you've ever seen, heard, smelt, or touched in your lifetime has been recorded and stored in this memory. Now that's a great tool added along with this ability to use reason and logic, right, our intellect. However, it's creating a glitch, an error message, because the subconscious part of your mind that's operating in the present, when it accesses data or old information from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it believes something's happening now. And so it's going to create a response for an action. The purpose of an emotion like fear is to escape a threat. So if you think of something that happened to you 10 years ago and you start to feel fear, it's an error message. Your mind is trying to call for an action. The purpose of an emotion, a feeling, a sensation, or a thought is an action. And that's why, like you mentioned earlier, the amount of thoughts that our mind is producing on a day-to-day basis are all really calls for action. Do something now. And so if it's asking you to do something about something 10, 20 years ago, right, that's interfering with your ability to stay present and in the moment. And that's what we fix.
Yeah, I really, really think that's so incredible. And so I really, I think it would be good to kind of talk about this program that you created. And maybe you can go back to when you started creating the program. I'm an entrepreneur and I'd love to hear how you kind of put basically the recipe together for people to step into that, initial sensitizing event. And so maybe we can start there, with your program tip. And do you find that you have to go back to maybe one sensitizing event, or do you have to go back to all of them? How, if someone's coming in saying, there's just so much going on in my life, I've had so much trauma, and are still going through trauma. Maybe they're going through a severe divorce and feel like they are just so held captive, because that's the way it can feel sometimes. It's so hard to reach out. Can you kind of help us understand, if they wanted to approach your program, how do they step into that? Is it one past trauma, or do you fix them up, all of them at once? Because I know that when you head down one vertical of a trauma, it oftentimes can clear up many others. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the process and how that happens. Because I think when people jump into having to face their fear or their trauma, the way that you've developed this program is really one not to approach of fear. It's really a beautiful process of not having to go back to the initial PTSD moment, which is just really the brain thinking it's happening now. Maybe you can share a little bit about how your program works. And I think it's really, really unique and incredible.
Yeah, perfect. Great question. What we do is we work on anywhere from 1 to 3 events. That's it. And sometimes it's rare to have just do one, but I've done that. So probably maybe 10% of the cases, probably 50 or 60% are 2, and then the other 20 or 30 will do 3.
Okay.
And we really don't need to do any more than that. Because once we get the mind to start resetting, our minds are brilliant. It just really takes this process and then starts. What I say is happening is that when we go to sleep at night, we go into that theta brainwave state, and then theta, the mind processes. So it's in a dream state, but in the dreaming, it's processing what it just learned from the day, and it starts applying it to all these events and experiences. So for an example, I worked with a lady who had had multiple sexual assaults when she was a child. And we worked on 3 different events. And when we finished, she said to me, she says, well, we're going to be here all day because I have a lot of these. And I said, we don't need to do any more. I said, your mind now understands and it'll start to process for you. She said, well, how does it do that? And I said, the mind's capable of healing. It's capable of doing this process for you. So anyway, we finished the session. I ran into her at a store just a month later, just coincidentally. And she came over to me and she says, I've got to tell you something. She says, as good as I was feeling, there was no question those events that we worked on were done. She says, I had no emotional response anymore. She says, but when you told me my mind would clear everything else, she says, I'll be honest with you, I didn't believe you. And she says, but I was at Universal Studios on the weekend with my daughter and husband, and I was riding on the escalator and I was looking over the railing. And my daughter said to me, Mom, look at what you're doing. And she says, I never told you I had a fear of heights. We never discussed it, and it's gone. She says, I got up to the top of the escalator and I could look over the railing and watch people walking underneath. She says, I was never able to do that before. So that's how our minds work. And the other thing is that I don't need any details, really specific details of the trauma. So for example, I'll ask them, I'll say, there's 3 different ways I can do this. One, I can do it just visually, where you don't describe anything. I just take you through a process in about 2 to 3 minutes. I'll get your mind to start resetting that data. Or if you want to talk about it, that's fine too. I'll use a different kind of process while you're talking about it. Or 3, I have you tell me in another language. And I says, I'm going to teach you a new language, and it's called flowing. And there's only one word in the flowing language, and it's flowing. So instead of saying, I walked into the room, you're going to say flowing, flowing, flowing. And what they're doing is they're going into memory to start pull it up, even though they're saying flowing. Okay. And why that is so helpful especially for a woman who's gone through a sexual assault, to sit there and start having to go into details about that event is very, very difficult. That's why by saying flowing, I have no idea what the details are, and it's not important for me. The process will clear it.
So at that time when they're saying flowing, 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 are they bringing up the past traumatic effect, or what are they visualizing? What are they processing when they're saying flowing and creating new memories out of that memory? How does that exchange work?
Yeah, so what they're actually doing is looking at the traumatic event, but they're going to do this in about 2 to 3 minutes. Okay. So I don't need a lot of description. And while they're even saying flowing, I'm taking them through a process. So all I'm interested in is having them actually seeing and experiencing it in that 2 to 3 minutes. And while they're doing that, I'm taking them through a series of processes to get their mind to start resetting it. And generally by the time we're finished, it's done. And so for example, I worked with a U.S. Army sniper who had to shoot and kill a 12-year-old boy. He couldn't even talk about it. He just sobbed. And by the time we were finished in that 3 minutes, he could then tell me every detail of that event and talk about it. And so many times too, is after we do that clearing, they actually can talk about it because there's so much shame and guilt that's gone along with it that they've wanted to hide it. They don't want to talk about it. But by the time we're finished, that lifts, right? There's a release. There's no longer that shame and guilt along with it, or wanting to cover it up and hide it.
That's incredible. That's really incredible. Now, so if I were to explain it in a hypnotherapy session, I do a lot of regressive and regression therapy. And, I really love that the mindfulness and the neuroplasticity industry, Joe Dispenza, all of these wonderful thought leaders have brought it forth, and people are really taking on to it like storm. But my belief is without some of that regression and going back to those sensitizing events and having the client do their own reprogramming and problem solving, and that's really all I like to explain it as, is it's really truly just problem solving. And same with you, we don't always have to go back to that event. We can do some rewind and fast forward techniques, where they can go back and address the perpetrator and just really kind of bring closure to that, really see it in their spirit eye, their mind's eye now as an adult, a thriving survivor, and go back and capture that young child and bring them back up to their future self and understand that they're safe and they're, they survived. And so I really see these two, what we do in a setting is obviously a little bit longer and a little bit more probably active on the client side. How did you come to this resolve around this very, very fast first part of the technique? And then how do they then prolong this event? Because what I do know is that we do a lot of positive mind management. And unless they can't save themselves from the negative self-talk, that past, just how they treat themselves and how they set up the rest of their environment, it's going to be really hard for them to sustain that. So how do you then help them go through that so quickly and then help them prolong and sustain that state of mind?
Okay. So what we do basically, I said, we're looking at about 3 different events.
Okay.
But at the same time, when we're doing that, and I said we're doing a very short period of time, prior to that, I've been doing a lot of education and science behind why this is happening.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes a lot of the fear out of it. Is that when we start with the premise of there's nothing wrong with you,
Mm-hmm.
right? If I'd experienced life exactly like you did, I'd be experiencing it exactly like you are.
Exactly.
Right? So I was fortunate enough not to have trauma, right?
Yep.
I had little things here and there. But the advantage for me is I believe that because as a child, my central nervous system was constantly coming back into balance
Mm-hmm.
because I had this environment. So I was learning how to deal with that and get back to center. For
Right.
my wife, she was knocked so far off center from all the things that her mind was constantly feeling that danger is everywhere.
Yep.
And she could see it in places that to me didn't make any sense. And I couldn't understand why she was experiencing that, yet she couldn't understand why I couldn't see it.
Yep.
So it was because she was filtering through what I call atmospheric conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Her atmospheric conditions were completely different than mine. So I'm in Florida, sunshine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she's in these dark atmospheric conditions where her life didn't feel safe
Right.
because she'd grown up in a different kind of world than I did.
Yep.
And so if you filter through those atmospheric conditions, of course, your mind, right, is going to see the world differently.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're saying, what I tell people is what we're going to do is we're going to clear up your atmospheric conditions, which then changes the way your mind filters through thought. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's going to change the way your mind produces thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And so after we finish that, then we have them listen to a series of audios, because I said we're really dealing with 2 memory systems. We're dealing with the explicit, implicit memory of the way we store details about events and experiences.
Right.
And then we have to work on the procedural memory, which is the same as the animal mind, where we learn through association and repetition.
Mm-hmm.
So they do a series of audios for 28 days, 21 days of walking out behaviors, and then 7 days of walking in gratitude. And so it's resetting the old patterns, what I call codes,
Mm-hmm.
because the mind codes. And we're having a lot of success with addiction, because what I tell people who are in addiction is that your mind has built up a code that the substance that you're using is connected to your survival. However, it's not true.
Yep.
But your mind has built the code, and it's going to follow the code. So we have another 28 days with addiction where we get the mind to reset the code.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there is, just like in the pharmaceutical world, everybody's looking for a pill.
Yes. Yep.
I just want to make it very, very clear that there is a very active process on the processor's side that, I have nothing but love, admiration, and respect for those that are active and proactive and going after these things in our lives that are keeping us stuck. But I always think of a reciprocal process. When we give life to someone, it gives life to us back. And it's the same with ourselves. When we get into a flow of giving ourselves life, it just gives us our lives back. And so, people that come from, chronic illness or what have you, once they start to come out of that, no matter if it's 2% or 3% better, the way they feel from the way they've always been is so freeing that it becomes addictive to become free.
Yes.
And
that's why we call our program a performance program.
Mm-hmm.
It's not therapy. Because if we start with the premise there's nothing wrong with you, there's nothing that we just need to reset the mind, right? Just like a computer. I always say if I hit my M key and my computer shut off, there's nothing wrong with my computer. It
Mm-hmm.
just has an error code message. So
Mm-hmm.
we just have to get the mind to rebuild the code so that the M key becomes an M and it doesn't shut the computer off.
Mm-hmm.
Then it performs at its best. So what I always say is, what's interfering with you performing at your highest and best level? And it's generally these events and experiences, whether they're small t or big T,
Yep.
right? They're going to have an effect on your life, the way your mind works. So once we reset that, now it's clear. And once your mind is clear, it produces thoughts differently.
Mm-hmm.
It's not filtering through those old events and experiences because it loops. Trauma keeps looping, and that's what's keeping them in that stuck position.
Mm-hmm.
Once we reset that, then the mind changes the way it operates, just like a computer. So it's like, and somebody said to me, well, how do I know it won't come back? And I said, well, if we put Windows 10 in your system, Windows 7 doesn't come back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a new operating system now.
Yeah.
And so we've been doing this for years now, and people going all the way back to, 5, 6 years ago, that trauma no longer creates any kind of a response in them.
Yeah. I think it's so powerful. It's so very powerful. And then I found another fly. Going to that, to say how powerful that is. So going back to my money analogy and women and trauma and fears, I mean, in women, just the way that they've been conditioned ever since they were young, the way they were told to act and to display themselves and that they needed to then have kids. And now we have these women that are maturing and finding that they really like self-actualization and careers, and they're having children later in life. And there's like this guilt and underlying shame and all these systems that run in the back of our brain, just societal, what we're born into, just, the way it is. And 61% of women would literally rather talk about how to prepare for their death than talking about money. That's just a very, high level, just a very, common thing women have a fear of. And, let's go back into childhood, because between the ages of 0 and 7, we don't have this critical factor, this analytical mind, kind of what you were talking about with the mammalian brain is what comes in is just kind of stored and planted. And not all children have control over their childhood. And so that environmental experience is very much theirs, that's stored and then compounds on the experiences thereafter the age of 7. And, my hypnotherapy mentor quoted that by the time a kid is 17, they've seen over 38,000 murders. Okay. Right. And then we go into the addiction piece of young men and, I interviewed Dr. Lindsay Berkson, and she said that men of age of 27 are coming in with ED, erectile dysfunction, because of the pornography addiction. Yep. So maybe you can tap into a little bit about, okay, we've got women in that industry, autoimmune diseases. I know it well with background in functional medicine is part of that, releasing cortisol in that framing in the back of the mind that's always going, keeping the body in inflammation. But now let's go back into how can we help our kids? How can a mom help their kid that has an addiction or an unstable brain or is told they have ADHD and just can't function?
Well, we put all these labels on these different things, but they're all coming from the same area. It's coming from inflammation. When I talk about it, what I say is unresolved trauma creates inflammation in the body. Mm-hmm. The inflammation in the body compromises the immune system and the neurotransmitters. Yep. So we're getting physically sicker and at the same time feeling bad because our neurotransmitters are affected. Right. And so the only solution they have is to medicate them. Yep. But we're not fixing the problem. So when we have this unresolved trauma, the cells go into a cell danger response. So they actually develop a hardened membrane. So they develop and that's to protect it. It goes into a protection mode. Right. And the purpose of that is to protect the cell from anything penetrating it, any foreign invader, bacteria or whatever it is, until the danger passes. But as we know, the danger never passes because of the way our mind has stored the information about the danger. No animal can do that. If an animal, and I always use this as an example, a zebra cannot feel fear of a lion unless there's a lion present. Mm-hmm. So zebras can't imagine lions, and zebras can't remember lions, but if a lion shows up, zebra's nervous system will be fully activated to protect the zebra. We have the exact same system, except we've added memory. And that's what's creating these glitches and error messages, putting us into inflammation, which is then compromising our immune system. And then we end up with autoimmune issues, and all we're doing is medicating it. And what I discovered when I did a lot of the research into the medications, what I found out was a lot of these antidepressant, anti-anxiety medications have anti-inflammatories in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I realized is I don't necessarily believe in every case that it's actually the medication that is actually fixing it as much as it is the inflammation going down.
Right.
That's fixing it.
Right.
And so, and at first I couldn't understand why would they put anti-inflammatories into medication? And I think it's because the cells can't absorb the medication when they're inflamed.
Yep.
So they have to get the inflammation down to get their medication in. So the question is it the medication that's working, or is it the inflammation going down that is actually helping?
Or is it the placebo effect?
Possibly, yes.
You know, I think I'm getting better. I mean, the placebo has been shown to have powerful effects over medication in its hands. So
absolutely.
You know, I love your analogy of how the membrane actually literally hardens, you know, and so, you know, think of that and then put that analogy into anger. You know, if you've got a body full of inflamed, hardened material that's meant to be fluid and have just the ebb and flow in between life circumstances and events and what have you, and be able to repair effectively, you're always in fight or flight. And so, of course, you're going to have outbursts. Of course, you're going to have anger that just comes out. And then, you know, you have these thoughts where, I don't know, my mind it just came out of me. Well, as the mind thinketh, the mind beeth, and that's the kind of state that the body is in. So it's really, like you said, it's the, you know, the fear or the trauma is just information, and that's really coming out from the emotion that's stored in the body. So do you have any other comments around if you're seeing a client come in and they are heavily medicated? What has been your experience? I know for me, they're a little bit less reactive, but we're able to get there. In hypnotherapy, can you tell me about what your experience is if they're on medications and they still want to go through with your program?
That's probably been the only place where we have difficulty.
Yep.
Is if they're heavily medicated, I can't get their mind to process, because the purpose of the medication is to block the mind from processing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had one guy come in, he was literally drunk. I mean, I could smell the alcohol, and I thought, well, I'm going to try it anyway.
Yeah.
Right. But I could not get his mind to process.
Yep.
And so if they're on heavy medications, it's very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as they're on, you know, they can be on some medications, but not heavily medicated.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's really what my experience has been. But it's fairly rare. Mm-hmm. And, you know, most of the people who are coming in are looking for some help, and they're not too heavily medicated, and I can work through that.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, back to the cell danger response, is the problem that we're seeing is that cell danger response is to protect the integrity of the cell. So nothing's getting into the cell, but it also means nothing's getting out.
Right. Yep.
So it's not processing. So I believe that's a lot of times where we're seeing cancer come in.
Yep.
Because the cell is actually, you know, fermenting in itself and not processing. And if that inflammation stays because the mind doesn't think it's out of danger, that's what was happening to my daughter. Her lower intestinal area was constantly inflamed. The only way they could get that down was to give her heavy doses of steroids.
Mm-hmm.
But that creates a whole new set of emotional issues that she's dealing with.
And health issues. So yeah, it's just a reciprocal on medications and issues and autoimmune. And, you know, I feel like there is a body of professionals and medical professionals, specifically functional medicine and some others that are really getting to the root. And, you know, you can even go into nutraceutical therapy, and even genetics is really profound, but it really comes down to, and what I have learned, I mean, I can paint a woman all day long with hair color or beautiful makeup, or cut their hair and make them just look exactly like the picture they wanted it to be when they came in. But guarantee the next time they come in, they're just as messed up in their marriage, they're unhappy, and whoop, it looks like we lost Dr. Don Wood. Hold on one moment, and I will be back, and we'll bring him back on.